Hi, ladies, and welcome back to our next PowerPoint lecture. This will be one of our last ones for the year. So, this week we're going to be concentrating on the civil rights movement. I decided to kind of go backwards before we wrap things up because this is sort of like the precipice or like the movement that kind of activates a lot of things that happen in the 60s, including like anti-war protests, the women's movement, a few things we won't really be able to get into detail because of time, but wanted to, of course, spend a little bit more time because it's such an important time period. So just want to do a quick review and want to go back to the beginning of the year. So think about it was probably like, I don't know, maybe the second or third like topic unit that we covered when we learned about Jim Crow and segregation. So when we talked about what happened after the Civil War and during Reconstruction with Jim Crow laws and those Jim Crow codes. So recall that those are mostly, I mean, they were in all states in some level because we obviously had segregated schools, but really we see these mostly in the South. So Jim Crow codes, Jim Crow laws, which really segregate races at any public facility, anything like a water fountain, a park, hospital. And this was pretty much legalized by the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. So Plessy versus Ferguson is a landmark Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court basically says that segregation is legal as long as there are equal facilities. And so we call that the separate but equal law, which of course we know that that was not true because any facility that was for African Americans was definitely inferior to like the normal accessible things to whites. So this lasts for a very, very long time. So Plessy versus Ferguson was in 1896. And that pretty much stays that way until Brown versus Board of Education, which you read a little bit about if you hopefully have already done the first part of the notes from your book. So Brown versus Board of Education was the turning point in terms of starting to, it's not the end particularly of segregation, but it's the start of desegregation, or we could say integration, because it starts there with the schools. So kind of moving forward in this year, we looked at the New Deal, which the New Deal was kind of an interesting point in time as well, because you have obviously the Great Depression, which is horrible for all of the U.S., high unemployment rates, people suffering, immensely, whether that's through job loss or kind of losing everything. And for African Americans, it was doubly as hard because they're already in a pretty bad place in terms of, lack of unemployment and things before that happened. And so the New Deal and in FDR in general has a little bit different of a take. I mean, I can't say that it was like total equal by any means, but it was definitely more of a stance or more of something that the federal government does than any time before. And so we had Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the head. She was an African American woman who held the highest point position in the New Deal as the head of or the director of Negro Affairs of the New Deal. So that was something that was particularly interesting because it was something that was directed at relief for that particular group. World War II will be a really interesting turning point in civil rights. So I mentioned before that sure, this unit's called the Civil Rights Movement, but civil rights doesn't just spring up one day in the 1950s. This is something that starts right after the Civil War ends. So as soon as slavery ends and African Americans are part of normal society there are still obviously a lot of challenges and obstacles that are faced. So this is like kind of just a review of a very quick review of what happens in those almost 100 years. So World War II is interesting because, as we studied before, when it started, remember that there was segregated units, and then by the end there wasn't, and that was mainly because of the reality of war, right? When you're on the front line, you are helping the person next to you. It doesn't really matter who they are or what they look like. You're worried about saving your own life and saving the people that are around you. So the military is actually one of the first, if not the first, institutions in the U.S. that actually integrates by default. So there is no segregation in military after World War II, and that kind of becomes part of this like resurgence, because just like in any movement, whether it's the women's suffrage movement, temperance movement that we've studied, you see these peaks and valleys, right? So this is starts to kind of go up this peak, and we see that that helps fuel what will be the climax or the high point of the civil rights movement, as well as here at the home in the homeland during World War II, we've got a lot of especially African American women that are working alongside white women in factories and all kinds of different work, because that's what was needed. So kind of stepping up to that challenge and kind of rising above what's happening really shows that that obviously this stuff shouldn't be happening, and there should be equal opportunity for all. The NAACP, that was an organization we kind of talked about when we were studying Jim Crow, because it does arise at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. And that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they're the ones, this organization will work within the law, and they're trying to change the law. They're really one of the big forces behind Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s, along with other important cases. So I'm just kind of briefly going to go through this. This, I don't believe, is a part of your note packet, because you kind of read about this, and this is just Brown versus Board of Education. This is when the separate but equal, that basically Plessy versus Ferguson is ruled unconstitutional and has no place in schools. And that starts with 8-year-old Lynda Brown, and her father sued the school board. So that's in Topeka, Kansas. And that goes on to the Supreme Court. And so by 1955, school boards should be integrating. So integrating is the bringing together of different races. Of course, this also agitates those that don't believe that this should have happened. So, we see, I know a lot of times, like you see on the news and you see things that are happening nowadays where you got, like, especially even right now with the coronavirus and all the stuff that's happening, you've got people that, are doing what they're supposed to do. And then you've got these people that are protesting down at the Capitol building and all this crazy stuff that's happening. This happens a lot of times throughout U.S. history where you're always going to have an oppositional side, even though it might be a minority. So we see, this especially in the South. So remember that this is changing or trying to change hundreds and hundreds of years of what the South was like. So most people, really part of human psychology is sort of this like fear of change and what could happen. So this kind of brings us back into the beginnings of what will be a pretty violent fight to actually make this real. So you can change the law all you want, but in order for it to actually work, there's going to be a lot of resistance, and you actually have to, still keep fighting. And that's what we see these people doing in the 50s and 60s. And so now we're going to start with your note packet. As the struggle intensifies, I know all of you are familiar with Rosa Parks. And if you're not, I don't know where you have been in your social studies education, because you should have learned about Rosa Parks back in grade school. But she is known for the woman who refused to give up her seat on the bus for a white man. And she, really interesting woman, first of all. So she was active in civil rights, stuff before this actually happened. And although she did not set out that day to like get arrested, she wasn't out there trying to be, this like hero person, but she felt that, she worked all day. She got on the bus. There was an empty seat. She sat, where she was supposed to. And when the bus driver asked her to get up to give her seat up to a white guy, she was like, no, like I paid my fare. The seat was empty. Like I'm not getting up. And so she was therefore arrested because she technically broke the law, segregation or Jim Crow laws. And this was down in Montgomery, Alabama. So she was charged. She went to jail. You see her picture down here at the bottom being processed. And so she becomes this like icon. And I think more of like this like inspiration to, especially to African Americans who were specifically in the city at this point. So they see her doing this, and then it kind of sparks these other things that happen, specifically the Montgomery bus boycott. So in the months following Rosa Parks, it kind of just sparks like a chain of events that happen. And so there was a call for a bigger boycott that was pushed by local civil rights activists, and they called upon the Black community to stop riding the bus. So you have to think about this economically. So think about what the word boycott means. Boycott means that you're not using a product, you're not buying that product. So therefore, in this situation, the bus companies are losing money, right? Because African Americans were paying the same fare to ride the bus. Okay. So they're losing. There was 50,000 Blacks that refused to ride the bus that year. So think about using like monetary protesting that helps as well. In the meantime, the NAACP is working within the court system for a legal challenge to try to end segregation on buses. So we see, many people rise up, but we see specifically a few leaders that will become the leaders of this part of the civil rights movement, specifically Martin Luther King Jr., who become, obviously when you think of civil rights, it's probably the first person that you think of, although there were many, many people that helped in this movement. But this was historically significant because it starts to bring about this national movement. So yes, we've got Brown versus Board of Education. It's kind of already starting. And this is sort of all around the same time. This is kind of mid-50s. But there's all different sides to it. It's not just like one thing. Okay, well, now we got schools. Well, what about this? What about, just society in general? So it kind of starts this whole new movement to bring equality for African Americans. And of course, this comes in the form of protests. So the civil rights movement is, obviously it's a big part of U.S. history in this time period, but more importantly, it sets a precedent for future movements, including the women's movement. I mentioned like anti-war movement, even things that happen now. We look back to how successful was the civil rights movement, and mainly it's because of the peacefulness. And part of that is just showing, using, if you've studied MLK and you've studied his message, it's like beyond that. It's like looking at here are we as a group of people being peaceful, right? We are being, we just want to, go and sit in a restaurant. We just want to go and ride on a bus. Or we want to march down a street. It's the reaction to it. Okay. So the reaction that brings violence, really shows the dichotomy of like these two sides. So you've got the peaceful like movement that really creates like violent reactions, which is really sad, but it just really shows how ingrained this type of lifestyle, segregation and Jim Crow, was in the South. So one of the forms of protests that activists will use is called the sit-in. So you saw the teach-in. I think we did the teach-in with Vietnam. This is actually called the sit-in. The sit-in happened before the teach-in. And the sit-in is when protesters or activists put themselves in a place where they most likely don't belong and they refuse to move. So if you look at the picture up here on the screen, you've got a lunch counter. And a lunch counter in segregated Jim Crow South meant that only white people were allowed to sit at the counter. Now, if you look at the picture, you'll notice that it's not just white, black, and, integrating race, but you're also integrating gender, which, as we know, because we studied some of those crazy, horrible Jim Crow laws back in the fall, that anything with integrating or intermixing of the races, especially when we're talking about white women and black men, this was actually against the law. Like, you could not date interracially. So putting them together at lunch counters, now they're not doing anything, right? They're just like sitting in a place. They just want to be served. It forced business owners to decide between serving them or losing business. But the reaction to the other people inside, the restaurant could often turn violent. So you would either have like potentially, people getting dragged off their chairs and beaten up, spit on, best case scenario, your name called. Sometimes the police were called and they were arrested. So there wasn't just like, oh, okay, you're all sitting here, so I'm just going to serve you. A lot of times it ends up being, arrested or harassed. But what this continuance of doing this, it's just showing that, what's wrong with this? Like, we're just people. Like, we're just people that want to eat a meal, and who cares if we're sitting together? So again, you can kind of see that dichotomy between like the peaceful side of it versus the reactive side. One of the biggest events that takes place in the early 60s is called the Freedom Rides. And this really showcases how deep-seated racism and segregation was in the South. And you had this group of activists that were a part of this group called CORE. And these were mostly early, like pretty young, like college students. So I'm probably not much older than you all. And these were Black people and white people and men and women. And they wanted to test these new laws. So basically, there were laws that that the Supreme Court had ruled in 1960. It was a case called Boynton versus Virginia, that segregation on interstate buses and in waiting rooms were illegal. Okay. So think of like Greyhound buses, like those kind of buses, not city buses, but buses that travel like interstate lines. So that might not be as big of a deal in the North, but if you're traveling in the South, they wanted to see if this was actually like, if they're actually following the law, which, obviously they're probably not going to be, but they want to kind of test that out. So they plan to take this bus ride from DC to New Orleans. And this actually happens over a period of time, but we're going to kind of concentrate on the first like group of riders. And if we were in class, which I'm going to post a couple of the video clips, I can't get the whole thing. It's a PBS documentary. They don't have it online. I have it on a DVD, but we would have actually watched the first part of this documentary called The Freedom Riders. And it's honestly, it's disturbing. I would have told you that. And some of the clips you'll see are very disturbing, but it's such an interesting, just such an interesting and brave thing that these people do. But basically, what happens is that they will encounter deep, deep violence. really horrible things once they get into the deep south. Okay, so these are people that are like just kind of in the lunch counter picture, men and women, black men, white women, white men, black women, all sitting together on a bus. Now, it's not the whole bus is protesters or activists. They mix in with like normal people that are just like riding the bus. Okay, so one of the buses, and this is one of the clips that you'll see that I'll post. They stop for like a bathroom break, and they come they encounter in Anniston, Alabama, pretty much a group of like Ku Klux Klan people, but townspeople. And remember that the deep South in those rural areas are just like, boiling over with racism and people that don't want to change. So basically the bus gets attacked. They get like driven off the road. The tires get blown. The anti, I don't know, the hateful people, I guess we'll call them, will surround the bus. You see the picture down in the bottom. They actually try to like block all of the exit doors so that people can't get out, and they firebomb the bus. Intervention by God, divine intervention. They are able to open the doors and they get out, but a lot of them are hurt. And of course, they've been inhaling like carbon dioxide, and it's a pretty bad scene. And then they're beaten up once they're like off the bus. So it's a really, really horrible thing. In Birmingham, that second bus makes it there, but then they're attacked at the bus station. And that was actually planned by the police chief of Birmingham, and pretty much like turned the cheek. You have to go back to understanding like what life was like in the South, prior to this, almost 100 years before this. I'm not saying every single person was a racist, but of course it was like ingrained in people of a way of life, and people who were in law enforcement and in government were also part of the Klan. They were also part of some of these horrible things like mob lynching. So this is, you think about it, it's like early 1960s. It's not that long ago. And these people were still a part of orchestrating some of these things. So what happens is this gets on national news. And so it's on it's on the nightly news, it's in newspapers, and President Kennedy, who's the president at the time, was like looking at this like, what the heck is going on? And so he kind of steps in and says, we gotta like, help these people. We gotta stop these people from getting hurt. So he kind of makes like a deal with some of the governors down in the South, specifically because this was also like going on in Mississippi. So Kennedy, I'm not going to get into, I could talk all day about Kennedy's stuff with civil rights, because it's sort of like, you had to be sort of, as a Southern Democrat, you had to be, it was sort of an issue that you didn't necessarily deal with at the time. So it's interesting when you look at the history of politics to see what the Democratic Party has become today. It was not the Democratic Party from back then. Okay, the Southern Democrats were mostly made up of like racist leaders, but it was also like a big majority of that party. So as a Democratic president, and this was like historically the point until the Civil Rights Movement, really until Johnson, who comes right after Kennedy, will start to change the party's politics. But anyways, going back to Kennedy, he will sort of step in and agree with I shouldn't say agree, but kind of come to an agreement with Mississippi and Alabama governors, pretty much like threatening them to say, hey, like, we're gonna, like, as the federal government, step in if you don't like control what's going on down here. So historically, why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because, first of all, you just see like, some would say even Martin Luther King looked at some of these freedom riders. He met with them in Georgia on their journey and said, "You guys are kind of being idiots. Like, why are you doing this? We're not ready for this like step yet." But these younger, people were like, "Look, like we got to make a stand. We got to do something that is, is a little bit outrageous." And so they do achieve their immediate goal, which really was getting the federal government to see what's happening, what really is going on in the South, what's really the reaction to some of these changes in law. It's not that easy. And so the freedom rides actually continue well into the early 60s. It continues as the protests and things advance. So it doesn't just like end, but there's like different writers that come aboard and they keep doing this, and they do actually end up getting to New Orleans. So moving on, I mentioned again the Deep South, pretty violent, very deep-seated racism. But specifically, like the worst city historically is Birmingham, Alabama. So if you've studied Martin Luther King and you've studied that part of the civil rights movement, you may have know some of this, but this is where they will face some of the worst violence. And mainly because, like I said, that's that city specifically, and that's a big city. That's a very large city in the South. Was run by these white guys that were part of the Klan, that were extremely racist, and that allowed these things to take place. And that wasn't the case in every single, Southern city, but definitely in Birmingham. It was the most segregated city. The SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and other leaders, they planned a lot of their nonviolent boycotts, their marches, their sit-ins. They were arrested numerous times. And this was sort of where like the heart of a lot of, really Alabama in general, the heart of many of these protests will take place. And the violence that ensues after is, it's pretty scary. Martin Luther King Jr. is arrested, and he is in Birmingham at the time, which in the next part of our notes, we'll look a little bit at that. But he will just march again. So many of the civil rights leaders will continue to do what they're doing. They're not going to let, being arrested stop. Like, oh, okay, I was arrested. I guess I need to go home and stop this. They just continue. Okay. And again, it's a peaceful protest. Marching is a peaceful protest. They're not armed. They're walking on a street with signs, or maybe they're singing, or, whatever. Not hurting anybody. The police response to that was to force attack dogs on these people. Fire hoses. So if you've ever seen or I don't know, like if any of you have family that are firefighters or something, the water pressure that comes out of a fire hose is not like your garden hose in the backyard. Okay. It's actually very, very painful if you were to get like sprayed with a fire hose. So putting that on innocent people was definitely a violent reaction. So we're going to end it here because I'm trying not to make these like super long. So part 2, we'll actually pick back up with talking about MLK and what he writes in his jail cell while he's being held in Birmingham. So I will see you next time.